Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Lieutenant Commander Desmond Woods. Today marks the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore, one of the worst military disasters to befall Australia and one of the greatest defeats in British history. Imperial defence planners had regarded Singapore as an impregnable fortress, but by the outbreak of the war in the Pacific, the military resources required for the defence of the Malayan Peninsula, including modern fighter aircraft, had not been adequately provided. From the initial attack on the 8th of December 1941, the Japanese advanced rapidly through Malaya, overwhelming the British and Commonwealth troops. Singapore fell to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942. Some 1,800 Australian soldiers had died in the fighting and 15,000 immediately became prisoners of war. The island's fall marked one of the darkest periods in Australian history. Within a 7-week period, 22,000 Australians, including 71 nurses from the Australian Army Nursing Service, had the misfortune to become prisoners of war. In addition, 1,500 Australian civilians, men, women and children, were captured or interned across the region. It was a time of great anxiety and suffering, not only for the prisoners, but also for loved ones at home, who would have little, if any, knowledge of the fate or even the whereabouts of the missing troops until after the war ended. The significance of the prisoner of war experience to Australia's Second World War story can be measured by the profound loss of life. 1/3 of those captured did not survive their captivity. These losses made up half of all the combat-related deaths suffered by Australian servicemen and servicewomen during the Pacific War, and the suffering of the survivors continued long after their return home. Today, we remember the fall of Singapore. We pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour and to the survivors who returned home. We warmly welcome the family of Private Harry Bernard Longley, whose story will be told shortly. We are honoured to welcome His Excellency Mr Kwok Fook Seng, Singapore High Commissioner, and Mrs Pearl Kwok, the Honourable Andrew Gee, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Shane Newman, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel, and Brigadier Marcus Simpson, Defence and Military Advisor, British High Commission, and Mrs Lucy Simpson. We're also honoured to welcome Mr David Ross, President Emeritus of the 8th Division Association, Mr Roger Perry on behalf of the 1st 19th Australian Infantry Battalion Association, Mr Ray Warden on behalf of the 2nd 19th Australian Infantry Battalion Association, Mr Bob Goff on behalf of the 2nd 30th Australian Infantry Battalion Association, Mr John King, President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT branch, Air Commodore Peter McDermott, retired, representing Air Force Association, and all the survivors who are joining us to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, attention! Catapult party, present arms.
Australians
Please be seated if you can do so. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the hearts of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Harry Longley was born on the 23rd of July 1923 in Yass, New South Wales, one of 6 children born to farmer and grazier Ernie Longley and his wife Kathleen. Harry received his education at Yass Convent School and spent much of his childhood on his father's property, Longaroo, near the Cavan. There he became a keen horseman and helped his father to run their large property. Harry Longley enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 23rd of July 1940, his birthday. Although only 17 years old and too young to enlist, he stated he was 21 years old and was accepted. Private Longley was sent to Walgrove Camp near Sydney to begin a period of training. In November, he was posted to the 27th Brigade headquarters for 6 months before joining the newly raised 2nd 29th Infantry Battalion at Bathurst, taking on a role as a truck driver while he continued training. On the 31st of July 1941, he boarded the troop ship Marnix van San Aldegarde in Melbourne, bound for overseas service. In the wake of rising tensions with Japan, his unit was sent to Malaya. Arriving in Singapore on the 15th of August, the 2nd 29th was stationed in southern Malaya, where they continued training and prepared to fight in jungle conditions. Japan entered the war and began landing on the north coast of Malaya in the early hours of the 8th of December 1941. Japanese forces quickly swept through the area, outnumbering and outmaneuvering Allied units. They were forced into a fighting withdrawal. Private Longley wrote to his parents about his experiences. "It's quite a while now since you've had a letter from me. I suppose I've not had time to write as we've been moving all over the place. We are at last at war with the Japs. I suppose you've given me up for dead by this, but they haven't got me yet. At present, we're camped in the rhubarb trees. This morning, 10 Jap planes came over and we had to engage them with anti-aircraft guns. I don't care where they go, as long as they don't get to Australia." The 2nd 29th fought the Japanese to a standstill at Bakri, but outnumbered and outflanked, they were soon forced to withdraw. Their retreat was cut off at the Parit Silong Bridge. Longley was one of those about 500 Australians able to evade the Japanese and make it back to friendly lines. By the end of January, Allied troops had been forced all the way back to Singapore Island and were drawn into the desperate fighting to defend it. The scattered forces that remained were unable to hold back the Japanese as they began their attack on Singapore on the 8th of February, and Singapore was surrendered to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942. Over 15,000 Australian troops became prisoners of war, and among them was now 18-year-old Harry Longley. Harry and his comrades were placed in a prisoner of war camp at Changi, where they remained for 5 months. In May 1942, the Japanese began sending working parties to different overseas locations to complete major building projects. And Private Longley joined one of these working parties in July and was sent to Borneo as part of B Force to help construct a new Japanese airstrip. The men of B Force arrived in Borneo on the 18th of July and began establishing a new camp at Sandakan, or Sandakan. Harry was among a small group of younger soldiers who occupied the last hut and the last row at Sandakan camp. They soon became known as the Dead End Kids and earned a reputation for sneaking out of the camp and rebelling against authority. Initially, conditions at Sandakan were reasonable. Over time, however, the men became subject to beatings and torture, as well as starvation. Tropical disease, unsanitary living conditions, and malnourishment rapidly took their toll among men who were already overworked and exhausted. Private Longley and his comrades remained in the camp at Sandakan through 1943, living under increasingly horrific conditions. By 1944, Allied forces began closing in on Borneo, and in January 1945, the Japanese guards, fearful of an Allied invasion, began preparations to remove the remaining prisoners. The men were made to undertake a series of marches to the town of Ranau, some 260 kilometers west of Sandakan, in several groups. In late May 1945, Harry was among 536 POWs sent on the second death march to Ranau. Weakened by disease and malnourishment, the prisoners were forced to make their way through dense jungle and rugged countryside under the watch of merciless Japanese guards. None of the prisoners were fit for the journey. More than half of them did not have boots. Many collapsed en route and either died from exhaustion or were executed by their captors. At the remote last camp, 8 kilometres south of Ranau, Harry was just one of 183 men left who'd survived the second march. There, the prisoners were forced to continue labouring for the Japanese, carting food and other supplies. Still on starvation rations and without access to medicine or shelter, casualty rates soared. Private Longley was carrying a load along the track on the 5th of July, 1945, when he collapsed and was unable to go any further. His mates later recall that they propped him up against a tree and placed the stub of a cigarette in his mouth before they were forced to leave him. As they continued along the track, they recalled hearing the sound of gunfire. "Harry's had his last cigarette," they said. Private Harry Longley's final resting place was never uncovered. Today he's commemorated on the Labuan Memorial in Borneo alongside more than 2,000 others who have no known grave. He was just 22 years old. Harry Longley's name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War, and his photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Harry Bernard Longley, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director and staff, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We particularly appreciate your visit despite the challenges posed by COVID and wish you all a very pleasant evening.